Abandoned for 117 years, the ship was brought back online by a human mechanic. At the far edge of the dock, partially hidden by fog and weeds, stood a massive, forgotten ship. Its hull was rusted and weather-beaten, with peeling paint revealing patches of iron corroded by decades of salt water and wind. Broken ropes dangled from the masts, and shattered windows along the bridge reflected the pale sunlight in fractured patterns. The ship had been abandoned for 117 years, a monument to human ambition, dreams, and misfortune, now left to the slow passage of time. For generations, the townspeople had passed stories about the ship from one to another. They called it the Iron Phantom, though no one could remember exactly who had given it that name. Some said it had been built for exploration, meant to travel far beyond the horizon, but had been caught in a violent storm during its maiden voyage. Others whispered that the ship carried treasures or strange inventions ahead of its time, though no one had seen any proof. To the locals, it was a ghostly relic, more of a reminder of the past than something that could ever sail again. Children dared each other to climb its rotting ladders, while old men shook their heads, recalling stories they had heard from their own fathers about the day the ship was abandoned. Among the few people who looked at the ship with something other than fear or sadness was Elias Turner. Elias was a mechanic in his mid-40s, with hands roughened by years of repairing engines and machines, and eyes that lit up whenever he encountered old machinery. He lived a quiet life, spending his days fixing cars, small boats, and occasionally antique devices for the townspeople. But Elias' true passion lay elsewhere. He loved machines from another era, those built when craftsmanship mattered more than speed or efficiency, when every gear, lever, and valve was a piece of art as well as a tool. And for as long as he could remember, Elias had been fascinated by that abandoned ship. He had first seen it as a boy, walking along the docks with his father. Even then, the enormous size of the ship had stunned him. Its masts seemed to touch the sky, and its hull was wider than any building in the town. Even covered in rust and seaweed, it had a sense of majesty that made it impossible to look away. Over the years, his curiosity had grown into obsession. He read everything he could find about the ship, old newspaper clippings yellowed with age, journals written by sailors who had once served aboard, and technical drawings preserved in the town's small maritime museum. Each page only made the ship seem more alive to him, as if it were waiting for someone to understand it again. Elias often imagined what it must have been like when the ship first left the dock over a century ago. He pictured sailors bustling across the deck, carrying ropes, hoisting sails, and checking instruments carefully. He could almost hear the creak of the timbers and the hiss of steam from the engine room. It was not just a machine to him. It was a living story, a giant heart of metal and wood that had been silenced too soon. That morning, Elias stood at the edge of the pier, notebook in hand, studying the ship. He traced his finger along sketches he had made of its engines, gears, and valves. In his mind, he ran through 100 possibilities of what could still work and what would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Most people would have seen only rust and decay, but Elias saw potential. He imagined the ship's engine room, hidden beneath layers of grime and corrosion, still waiting for someone to coax it back to life. His first step was simple observation. He walked along the ship's deck, each step causing the wood to groan under his weight. Loose planks shifted, and a small cloud of dust rose with each careful movement. Seagulls circled above, curious about the human who dared approach their ancient guardian. Elias inspected the deck fittings, the ropes, the anchor mechanisms, and the remnants of the steering system. Everything was covered in salt and rust, yet he could see the cleverness behind each piece of machinery, the way the engineers had designed it to withstand the harsh sea conditions. As he explored, he found fragments of letters tucked in corners of the captain's cabin. Some were yellowed and brittle, others faded to the point of near illegibility. One letter, however, was mostly intact, written by the original engineer who had designed the ship's engines. The words spoke of hope, determination, and pride in creating a vessel that could conquer the oceans. Elias felt a deep connection to this long-gone man. It was as if their passions were linked across time, separated only by the years and the silence of the ship. Returning home that evening, Elias could barely focus on his daily work. He sketched diagrams from memory, wrote notes about possible restorations, and even started building small models of the ship's engine parts in his workshop. His neighbors watched with mild curiosity. They had seen him obsessed before, whether with old clocks, antique cars, or rusted farm equipment. Yet this time, there was a seriousness in his eyes that made even the skeptics pause. Something about this project felt different. He wasn't just restoring a machine. He was reviving a piece of history, a giant that had slept for more than a century. Over the next few weeks, Elias began making plans. He measured every accessible part of the ship, documented broken or missing components, and started researching old manufacturing techniques. He realized that many of the tools and methods used to build the ship no longer existed, which meant he would have to innovate while respecting the original designs. The challenge was enormous, but the thought of seeing the ship move again filled him with excitement that overshadowed any fear of failure. The townspeople continued to watch him warily. Some thought he was wasting his time, others were genuinely concerned for his safety. The ship had been dangerous for decades, with sharp metal edges, unstable decks, and hidden holes that could easily cause injury. Yet Elias' determination only grew. Each evening he returned to the dock, flashlight in hand, notebook filled with observations, and tools ready to test any small repair he could attempt safely. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Elias climbed aboard once more. He stood on the bow, the wind tugging at his coat, and imagined the ship cutting through waves as it had long ago. He thought about the sailors who had lived, worked, and sometimes perished on this vessel, and he made a silent promise to honor their legacy. The ship had waited 117 years, and if it could, it would wait a little longer for him. The first part of his journey was not about engines or mechanics. It was about respect, observation, and understanding. Elias knew that before he could bring the ship back to life, he had to know every curve of its deck, every lever in its engine room, and every hidden mechanism. He spent countless hours walking its length, peering into corners, taking photographs, and making sketches. He even studied the tide patterns, knowing that the ship's stability in the water would be critical once it moved again. Through all this, a story began to form, not just of the ship, but of the bond between human and machine. Elias realized that this project was teaching him patience, ingenuity, and the importance of attention to detail. Every rusted bolt told a story, every cracked plank reminded him of the ship's resilience. And every time he imagined turning the engines over, hearing the familiar groan of pistons moving once more, his heart raced with anticipation. By the end of this period, Elias had become more than a curious mechanic. He had become a caretaker, a historian, and an explorer all in one. The ship was no longer just a rusting hulk. It had become a partner in his life's greatest challenge. And while the townspeople still whispered about foolish obsession, Elias knew that the real adventure was just beginning. After weeks of careful observation, Elias Turner knew it was time to move from studying the ship to touching it, examining it, and slowly bringing it back to life. He had spent countless hours walking along its decks, taking notes, and imagining the mechanisms hidden beneath layers of rust and time. But now he wanted more than imagination. He wanted action. He began by studying the engine room, the heart of the ship that had lain silent for more than a century. The main hatch was heavy and rusted, and he had to use levers, pulleys, and all his strength to pry it open. A cloud of dust and a faint smell of old oil greeted him as the hatch finally creaked aside. Inside, the room seemed frozen in a moment of history. Pipes twisted along the walls, gears stood still like statues, and the massive engine lay cold and silent, as if waiting for someone to wake it. Elias felt a thrill he had never experienced before. He approached the engine carefully. Every inch of it was covered in rust, but he could still make out its design. It was impressive, a complex blend of pistons, levers, and valves made to run with precision. Elias ran his fingers over the metal, feeling the contours, imagining how it moved when it was alive. He noted each broken part and each area where rust had eaten away the metal. He sketched diagrams, made lists of what he would need, and began planning how to restore it piece by piece. The first challenge was simple in idea but difficult in execution: cleaning the engine. Elias brought buckets of water, brushes, and solvents he had gathered from his workshop. He spent long days scrubbing rust and layers of salt away, revealing more of the machine underneath. As he worked, he discovered small surprises, hidden levers, forgotten gauges, and an intricate network of pipes that were still remarkably intact. Every discovery fueled his determination. The ship was more than a machine, it was a puzzle, and he loved puzzles. But progress was slow. The years had not been kind to the ship, and some parts were beyond repair. Elias had to carefully remove broken gears and rusted valves, keeping them as models for the pieces he would have to recreate. He worked in his workshop, using old blueprints and modern tools to craft replacements. It was meticulous work, and each part required hours of shaping, filing, and testing. Despite the difficulty, Elias never gave up. He was driven not just by curiosity, but by respect for the ship and the people who had built it. As he worked, Elias also had to navigate practical problems. The ship's location at the old dock made bringing in heavy tools difficult. He built temporary scaffolding and pulleys to move large components, carefully coordinating each lift. Sometimes planks broke beneath him, and he had to catch himself before falling. Other times, a sudden wave splashed up from the harbor, soaking the deck and making tools slippery. Each day was a test of patience, strength, and skill, but Elias welcomed the challenge. While the technical restoration was demanding, Elias also found himself learning about history. He read journals from the original crew, studying how they had operated the ship, how they had managed storms, and how they had maintained the engine. Their words, written in faded ink, guided him in his work. In a sense, he was not just restoring a machine, he was learning from the people who had built and sailed it, connecting with them across more than 100 years. There were setbacks. One day, a critical valve he had painstakingly cleaned and repaired broke under stress. Another time, a replacement gear he had fabricated did not fit perfectly, forcing him to start again. Elias often stayed late into the night in the engine room, working by lantern light, sometimes falling asleep at his bench surrounded by metal parts. But even in failure, he found lessons. He learned how to adjust his techniques, how to anticipate weaknesses, and how to respect the complexity of the ship. Despite all the hard work, there were moments of small victory. After weeks of cleaning and assembling, Elias managed to turn a minor auxiliary gear. It moved smoothly, humming with energy, though it was still disconnected from the rest of the system. He felt a surge of hope. The ship was responding, slowly but surely. He documented everything carefully, noting which parts were functioning and which still needed work. Each success, no matter how small, reminded him that the impossible might be possible. The townspeople, initially skeptical, began to notice his dedication. Some came to watch from a distance, curious about what he was doing. Children would sneak onto the pier to see the giant ship and the man who worked tirelessly on it. Occasionally, a neighbor offered help, bringing spare tools or lending advice. While Elias appreciated the gestures, he preferred to work alone, believing that this project required a personal connection, a hands-on understanding that could not be shared. One afternoon, while examining the ship's steering system, Elias discovered something remarkable. Beneath the layers of rust and corrosion, the original engineer had engraved small notes and numbers on the metal, marking adjustments and settings for the ship's operation. It was like a message from the past, a guide left for someone who could understand it. Elias smiled, realizing that the man who built this ship had anticipated a future caretaker. It was as if the ship itself had chosen him. Elias' restoration was not just mechanical. He had to learn to anticipate how the ship would react once powered. He studied old records of storms, tides, and sailing conditions, imagining how the massive vessel would handle rough seas. He considered safety, balance, and stability. Even a small error could damage the ship beyond repair. Every step required careful thought, and Elias became a student of both history and engineering, blending knowledge from the past and present. As weeks turned into months, the ship began to show signs of life. Small sections of the engine responded, valves turned, and gears moved. Elias began testing minor systems in isolation, making sure each part worked before connecting it to the rest. He celebrated each small success with quiet satisfaction, understanding that restoring a ship abandoned for over a century could not be rushed. Patience, he realized, was as important as skill. The emotional connection deepened. Elias often spoke to the ship as he worked, as if it were an old friend. He talked about his plans, his hopes, and his dreams. At times, he imagined the original crew listening, nodding their approval. He knew that the ship was more than a project. It was a bridge between eras, a living memory of human ambition and ingenuity. Each nut, bolt, and gear restored was a tribute to the people who had come before him. Elias also began keeping a detailed journal of his own, documenting every step, challenge, and discovery. He included sketches, measurements, and reflections on the lessons he was learning. He hoped that one day, someone else might read his notes and understand both the ship and the effort required to bring it back to life. It was a way of preserving the story for the future, just as he had studied the past. Finally, after months of labor, Elias felt a sense of cautious optimism. The auxiliary engines could now operate independently, and several critical components of the main engine were restored. The ship groaned slightly when he tested moving parts, as if stretching after a long sleep. Elias could almost imagine the pistons pumping, the steam hissing, and the wheels turning once more. He knew the real test was still ahead, but this small progress filled him with pride. Elias also began to understand that the journey itself was as important as the goal. The process of discovery, repair, and learning had transformed him. He had grown patient, resourceful, and deeply connected to history. The ship was teaching him lessons that went beyond mechanics, lessons about perseverance, respect, and human ingenuity. Each day, he felt a closer bond with the engineers, sailors, and visionaries who had first built the vessel. Word of Elias' progress began to spread more widely. A local journalist visited the dock, fascinated by the mechanic who had revived parts of a ship abandoned for more than a century. Though Elias was humble about his work, he allowed a small interview explaining his respect for history and his passion for restoration. The article captured the imagination of the town and beyond, drawing visitors who wanted to see the ship and the man who dared to bring it back to life. By the end of this period, Elias had accomplished what seemed impossible at the start. The ship was no longer a silent, decaying relic. It was waking up, slowly and carefully, under the guidance of one determined human mechanic. Every moving part, every cleaned surface, every restored mechanism brought the ship closer to its former glory. And though the main engine still lay dormant, Elias knew that he was ready for the next stage of the restoration, confident in his knowledge, skill, and determination. Elias often paused to admire the ship, standing on the deck as the wind tugged at his coat. He could imagine the past, sailors navigating storms, engineers monitoring gauges, and the excitement of departure on a clear morning. He could also imagine the future, when the ship might sail again, carrying both history and hope. For Elias, every day spent on the ship was a victory, not just of mechanics, but of human spirit. And so, the second part of the journey ended with a sense of quiet triumph. The first steps of restoration were complete. The foundations for bringing the ship fully online had been laid, and Elias Turner had proven that passion, patience, and perseverance could awaken even the oldest giants. The true adventure was only beginning, and the ship, once abandoned for 117 years, had already started to stir beneath the hands of its modern caretaker. The months of meticulous work had transformed Elias Turner from a curious mechanic into a determined restorer. The abandoned ship, silent and cold for 117 years, had begun to respond to his touch. Every small success had built his confidence, and now he faced the greatest challenge of all, awakening the main engines and bringing the ship fully online. This was no ordinary task. It required not just skill, but patience, intuition, and courage. Elias began by reviewing every component he had restored so far. The auxiliary engines now ran smoothly, valves moved correctly, and minor systems could function independently. But the heart of the ship, the massive steam-driven engine in the lower hull, remained dormant, its pistons frozen, gears locked in place, and pipes clogged with decades of rust and sediment. Elias studied the engine from every angle, noting every weakness, every missing piece, and every place that required reinforcement. He approached this task like a surgeon, careful not to disturb anything that could cause damage. The first step was cleaning and preparation. Elias spent long days scrubbing the engine with brushes, rags, and specially made solutions to remove layers of rust and grime. He worked carefully, using tools he had designed himself to reach hidden corners. Each day, the engine revealed more of its original design, and Elias felt a mixture of awe and responsibility. This machine had once been the pride of its builders, and now it depended on him to bring it back to life. Next came assessment and repair. Ilias inspected the pistons, the flywheel, the boiler, and the steam valves, checking for cracks, warping, or weakness. He took careful measurements and compared them to original blueprints he had reconstructed from old drawings and notes found in the ship's captain's cabin. When parts were too damaged, he fabricated replacements using a combination of old techniques and modern materials, always striving to respect the original design. The work required precision. One small misalignment could prevent the engine from functioning, or worse, cause irreversible damage. The challenge was not only technical but also mental. Days and nights blurred together as Ilias focused on the engine, often working alone in the cold, damp engine room. At times, he doubted himself. Could a human really restart a machine left untouched for more than a century? Was the metal too brittle? Had the ship's long abandonment doomed it forever? Yet every time he felt doubt, he remembered why he had started this journey: to honor history, to preserve ingenuity, and to prove that human determination could overcome time. Ilias relied on both skill and creativity. He improvised tools when necessary, fashioned custom wrenches, and developed ways to test moving parts without risking the engine. He experimented with lubricants, testing their effects on rusted surfaces. Some experiments failed, gears seized, pipes cracked, or connections loosened. But failure taught him lessons. He learned to anticipate stress points, to reinforce weak areas, and to work gently with metal that had grown fragile over decades. One evening, after days of careful work, Ilias attempted a small test. He moved a single gear in the engine manually, listening to the groans of metal and the faint hum of friction. It was a delicate operation, requiring him to align every piece perfectly. The gear moved, slow at first, then more freely, as if stretching after a long sleep. Ilias felt a surge of triumph. It was a small step, but it proved the engine could move, that life could return to this machine despite 117 years of silence. Encouraged, Ilias continued systematically. He worked on the boiler, clearing old sediment and replacing worn-out valves. He tested the steam system in segments, ensuring each part could handle pressure without leaks. Every day, progress became more tangible: small hisses of air, minor vibrations of pistons, and the faint scent of heated metal and oil. The ship was slowly waking under his hands. While the mechanical work was demanding, Ilias also faced emotional challenges. The ship was enormous, and each step required him to confront fatigue, frustration, and isolation. There were nights when he would sit on the deck, looking at the stars, feeling the weight of responsibility. The ship had waited 117 years for someone to care, and now it depended entirely on him. But these moments of reflection also reminded him why he persevered. Each success honored the men who had built the ship and those who had sailed it long ago. As progress continued, the townspeople's curiosity turned into admiration. More people came to see Ilias at work. They watched from the piers, asking questions and sometimes offering tools or assistance. Ilias appreciated their interest, but most of the work required solitude and focus. He often explained what he was doing to visitors, describing how each valve, gear, and piston worked. Many were fascinated to see a machine so old come alive under careful human hands. Ilias also discovered treasures from the past. While cleaning and repairing, he found old logbooks, journals, and personal notes from the original engineers and sailors. They detailed daily routines, maintenance tips, and personal reflections. One journal included a hand-drawn diagram of the main engine, with notes about its operation in storms and under heavy load. Ilias carefully transcribed these notes, using them to guide his restoration. In a way, the original crew was helping him from beyond the grave, offering wisdom through the decades. The turning point came on a chilly morning. Ilias had restored the main pistons and carefully aligned the gears. He had rebuilt the boiler, tested the valves, and ensured all safety measures were in place. Standing in the engine room, he took a deep breath and slowly began to turn the main crank. The engine groaned and creaked, a deep, low sound that echoed through the hull. Steam hissed gently, pistons trembled, and the metal vibrated under his touch. It was not yet fully operational, but it was alive. Ilias could hardly contain his excitement. For hours, he continued testing, moving each component, checking alignment, and making adjustments. Every successful movement was a small triumph, and the ship responded as if grateful for his care. He paused often to document everything, knowing that each detail might be crucial for the final steps. By late afternoon, he had achieved something remarkable. The main engine could turn under its own power, although only slowly and carefully. Elias smiled, feeling a sense of awe. The impossible was no longer impossible. The news of his progress spread rapidly. A journalist from a nearby town arrived with a camera crew, eager to document the miracle. Elias allowed them to film, explaining the process and the challenges he had faced. Viewers were captivated by the story. A human mechanic, alone, restoring a ship abandoned for 117 years. It was a tale of determination, skill, and respect for history that inspired everyone who heard it. Yet, Elias knew the journey was far from complete. The ship still needed testing under real conditions. He had to ensure the engines could operate continuously, that the hull was seaworthy, and that the ship could handle movement in the water without damage. There were still repairs to make, fine adjustments, and countless small tasks to complete. But the most critical challenge, reviving the heart of the ship, had been achieved. Elias often took quiet moments to reflect. He thought about the original crew, the builders, and the engineers who had poured their knowledge and dreams into this ship. He thought about the storms they had faced and the adventures they had undertaken. And he thought about the future, the possibility that this ship could sail again, carrying stories from both the past and the present. The thought filled him with a sense of purpose that went beyond mechanics. In those moments, Elias also realized something profound. The restoration was not just about machinery, it was about human connection across time. His work linked him to people who had lived, worked, and dreamed long before he was born. Every turn of a gear, every hiss of steam, every small vibration of the engine was a conversation with history, a continuation of the story the ship had begun more than a century ago. The final days of Part 3 were filled with a mix of anticipation and careful preparation. Elias ran the engines in controlled bursts, tested the systems, and ensured that every part could handle pressure and movement. The ship trembled with energy as if stretching after a long sleep, and Elias felt a sense of triumph unlike anything he had ever known. The vessel, once a silent relic, was alive again in his hands. As night fell, Elias stood on the deck, looking out at the dark water. The stars reflected on the surface of the harbor, and the wind whispered across the sails. He imagined the original crew standing beside him, proud and approving. And he imagined the day when the ship would move, engines humming, sails raised, cutting through waves once more. It was a dream that had begun 117 years ago, now brought closer to reality by a single man's determination. Part 3 ended with a mixture of success and anticipation. Elias had awakened the main engine, proven that the ship could live again, and laid the groundwork for the final steps of restoration. The story of the abandoned ship, silent for over a century, had entered a new chapter, and both the ship and its modern mechanic were ready for the challenges ahead. The air at the dock was heavy with anticipation. Elias Turner had spent months, almost a year, bringing the abandoned ship back to life. Every gear, valve, and piston had been tested, adjusted, and repaired. The auxiliary engines hummed reliably, the main engine moved smoothly, and the hull had been carefully inspected and reinforced. Now came the moment that Elias had been dreaming of for over a year, seeing the ship actually sail again. The town had gathered, quietly at first, watching from a distance. Families, children, and older residents peered over the pier's edge, whispers of excitement spreading among them. For some, the ship was a relic of their childhood, a memory of stories passed down from their parents and grandparents. For others, it was simply an enormous, mysterious object that had stood silent for more than a century. But today it was alive again, and everyone could feel it. Elias climbed onto the deck, feeling the familiar groan of the wood beneath his feet. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the salty scent of the sea. He checked every control, every gauge, and every lever, making sure everything was in its correct place. His hands moved with confidence born from months of work, a deep understanding of every component he had restored. He was not just a mechanic now, he was the guardian of a living piece of history. Slowly, carefully, he began the startup sequence. Steam hissed from the pipes, the pistons started to move, and the engine room vibrated with energy. The ship responded eagerly, as if sensing that it was finally allowed to move after so many years of waiting. The town watched in awe as the massive vessel trembled, the hull creaking and moaning under its own power. Children gasped, and older residents exchanged looks of disbelief, some even shedding quiet tears. Elias began the slow process of maneuvering the ship away from the dock. He worked the rudder, adjusted the throttle, and monitored the pressure gauges. The ship moved cautiously at first, sliding over the water as if testing its strength after more than a century of stillness. Small waves lapped against the hull, and the sound of rushing water echoed through the empty decks. Elias felt a rush of triumph. Every hour, every day, every month of careful labor had led to this moment. As the ship gained confidence, Elias opened the sails. They unfurled slowly, catching the wind, and for the first time in 117 years, the ship felt the force of nature propelling it forward. The combination of steam power and wind created a rhythm that was almost musical. The hiss of steam, the flapping of canvas, and the gentle groan of the wooden deck working together in harmony. Elias smiled, marveling at the ingenuity of the engineers who had built the ship so long ago. Their brilliance had survived the passage of time, and now it shone once more. The townspeople began to cheer. They ran along the pier, waving and calling out to Elias. Photographers and journalists recorded the moment, capturing images of a ship reborn, a testament to human determination and skill. News of the event spread quickly beyond the town. People from neighboring cities traveled to see the ship, eager to witness history in motion. For many, it was a lesson in patience, perseverance, and respect for the achievements of the past. Elias steered the ship slowly out into open water, feeling the balance between the engine's power and the wind in the sails. He navigated carefully, respecting the ship's age while also testing its strength. Each turn of the rudder, each adjustment of steam pressure, required his full attention. The ship responded beautifully, gliding through the water with the elegance of a vessel built for both purpose and adventure. During the journey, Elias reflected on the long path that had brought him here. He thought of the original crew who had sailed this ship, the engineers who had designed its complex mechanisms, and the storms it had survived before being abandoned. Their work, passion, and ingenuity had endured, waiting for someone to appreciate and restore it. Elias felt a deep connection across time, a bond with the people who had built something extraordinary so many years ago. He also thought about the lessons he had learned. Restoration had taught him patience, precision, and respect for craftsmanship. It had shown him that great things often require slow, careful work, and that perseverance can overcome even the greatest obstacles. Most importantly, it had taught him the value of believing in something that others might dismiss as impossible. Elias realized that the ship's revival was more than a mechanical achievement, it was a human achievement. As the ship sailed farther from the dock, Elias tested all systems under real conditions. The engine performed reliably, the steering was responsive, and the sails caught the wind perfectly. The ship creaked and groaned, not with weakness but with life, as if stretching after a century of rest. Elias felt pride and joy, but also humility. He knew that he had been entrusted with something extraordinary, and he was determined to honor that trust with careful handling. During the journey, Elias invited a few of the townspeople onto the deck, sharing with them the workings of the ship. He explained how the steam engine operated, how the gears and pistons interacted, and how the sails and rudder worked together. People listened in awe, realizing that this was not just a restored ship, but a living lesson in history and engineering. Children's eyes widened with wonder, and older adults nodded in respect, seeing the care and knowledge required to bring the ship back to life. After several hours at sea, Elias returned to the harbor, guiding the ship gently back toward the dock. The town erupted in applause as the massive vessel slid into place, perfectly aligned and stable. Elias climbed down from the deck, exhausted but exhilarated. He felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond accomplishment. It was the feeling of completing a journey that had connected him to history, to craftsmanship, and to the human spirit. The ship's revival quickly became a story of inspiration. Journalists wrote about the mechanic who had restored a vessel abandoned for over a century, highlighting his dedication, skill, and perseverance. Engineers marveled at the ship's design, historians celebrated the preservation of a rare artifact, and ordinary people were inspired by the proof that passion and determination could overcome time itself. The story spread far and wide, showing the power of one person's vision and effort. Elias continued to maintain the ship, ensuring that it remained in perfect condition. He organized tour, demonstrations, and educational programs, sharing both the technical and historical aspects with visitors. He taught young mechanics about restoration, patience, and the importance of understanding the past. Through his work, the ship became a bridge between generations, a symbol of human ingenuity and the enduring value of history. Over time, Elias also realized that the ship had given him more than just a project. It had given him purpose. He had spent years caring for it, learning from it, and connecting with history, and in return, the ship had transformed him. He had become more patient, more thoughtful, and more appreciative of the skill and dedication required to create something lasting. The experience had strengthened not only his hands and mind, but also his spirit. The ship, once abandoned and forgotten, now sailed confidently in the harbor and beyond. It carried not only the memory of the original crew and engineers, but also the story of Elias Turner, the mechanic who refused to let it remain silent. Together, they became a living testament to perseverance, human ingenuity, and respect for the achievements of the past. Visitors often asked Elias what it felt like to see the ship move again. He would smile and say that it was like waking a sleeping giant, a combination of fear, excitement, and awe. He spoke of the lessons the ship had taught him, lessons about history, craftsmanship, patience, and the power of believing in something that others might consider impossible. And he encouraged everyone to look beyond what they see, to imagine what might be hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone willing to care. The ship continued to sail, not only for demonstrations, but also for exploration and research. Elias charted new courses, teaching visitors how to navigate the waters while respecting the vessel's history. Each voyage became a celebration of both past and present, showing that human effort and determination could breathe life back into something thought lost forever. Years later, when Elias reflected on the journey, he realized that reviving the ship had changed the town, too. It had inspired a new appreciation for history, mechanics, and creativity. Young people were learning skills once thought obsolete, engineers were revisiting old designs with fresh insight, and the community had found pride in preserving its heritage. The ship had become more than a machine. It was a symbol of resilience, curiosity, and the enduring power of human determination. Elias Turner stood on the deck one final evening, looking at the sun setting over the water. The ship, fully restored and operational, glimmered in the golden light. He thought about the 117 years it had waited and the months he had spent breathing life back into it. The journey had been long, challenging, and sometimes exhausting, but the result was worth every moment. The ship now sailed proudly, a bridge between history and the present, carrying stories of the past, lessons for the future, and the spirit of a human who refused to give up. As the wind filled the sails and the engine hummed steadily beneath him, Elias knew that the adventure had transformed both the ship and himself. The abandoned giant, silent for more than a century, had finally found its voice again. And in restoring it, Elias Turner had shown the world that time could be overcome by dedication, knowledge, and the courage to pursue what others might deem impossible. The ship, once forgotten, would sail for generations to come, a living story of triumph, history, and human spirit. And every time its engines roared and its sails caught the wind, it would carry not only passengers and cargo, but also the legacy of those who had built it and the modern mechanic who refused to let it remain lost to time.